Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Nestor Castañeda. I'm a lecturer in Latin American political economy at the Institute of the Americas at UCL. And today is a real pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Emily Morris, who is going to present a talk entitled A Journey Through the Cuban Economic Labyrinth. Dr. Emily Morris is a research associate at University College London's Institute of the Americas. She has previously worked as an economist at the Inter-American Development Bank and the Economists Intelligence Unit. As well, she has also been a lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and the London Metropolitan University. Her PhD thesis is on Cuban economic performance and policy in the post-Cold War period, and it was completed in 2012. Since then, she has published, presented, and consulted widely on the subject. She is currently engaged in multidisciplinary UK-Cuban research, collaboration on sustainable urban mobility, and financing infrastructure for development. And she is the coordinator of the UCL Cuba Research Network. So it is a real pleasure for me to have, to have you here today. And so without further delay, please join me in welcoming Emily.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for hosting me here and for being here. I thought I'd take this opportunity when asked about doing a lunch hour lecture, just to try to kind of explain some of the problems I have in my work. Because I'm doing Cuba, and as many people know, Cuba is often described as an exceptional country. They talk about the Cuban exceptionalism. They talk about US exceptionalism, Cuban exceptionalism. And of course, every single economy in the world is exceptional in one way or the other. But I think what I'd like to do is just think about the ways in which the Cuban economy are exceptional very briefly, and what problems that's created for my work. So if we look at this, there's Cuba sitting in the Caribbean Sea, the largest of the Caribbean islands. And one of the exceptional things about it is that it is still a socialist economy. After the collapse of the Soviet bloc, of course, most of the former Soviet bloc countries did the transition. Not all of them, but almost all of them. And Cuba is exceptional in that sense. And the other thing that makes it very exceptional is that red line between Cuba and the United States, which is the US sanctions against Cuba. So not only is it still a socialist economy, but it has this very special relationship with the rest of the world created by the United States. But it actually doesn't just affect US-Cuba economic relations. It affects Cuba's relations with everywhere else in the world because of the size of the US and its influence on international organizations, international finance, and international business. So those two characteristics of the Cuban economy actually mean that for two reasons, they make it very, very difficult for me to answer the most basic question that people ask me as an expert economist on the Cuban economy. It's like, how big is the Cuban economy? And how's it doing? And the way that we measure these usually is by national income. But those two features make it very, very difficult because, first of all, as a socialist economy, Cuba does not have a set of prices that matches anybody else's prices. That's one problem. Secondly, for practically every country in the world, and certainly for every country of the size of Cuba, the IMF and the World Bank have their own teams of people going through the national accounts of every country and producing their internationally comparable GDP figures, national income figures, not quite the same thing, but we can talk about that, for all countries, but except for Cuba. And so I've had to, in my work, is generate my own estimates of what GDP is in Cuba. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just, first of all, to look at how people have tried to do these estimates. And that's going to take most of the time, and there are 3 slides involved. But then I'm going to look at why that's a problem for Cuba, not being able to estimate its own GDP in any accurate way. And then also to reflect a little bit on what Cuba's difficulties with GDP actually tell us a little bit about what the problems with GDP or national income as a concept anyway. So I'm going to sort of touch all of those things. I warn you, it might get a little bit, in some ways it gets quite complicated, and I'm going to go quite a pace because I haven't got very much time, and so that's the idea, is to take you into the labyrinth and lose you there, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. So first of all, let's just have a look at this question of the size of the Cuban economy. So what do people do about it? What I've got presented here is the IMF's figures for the GDP per head of each country in the world measured in US dollars, okay? And you get this kind of array of countries going from the richest, there's US, Norway and Sweden up at that end. Above them are tax havens, and there's a problem with the accounting system, but pretty much Norway tops the league. And the US is right there. The UN estimate puts Cuba somewhere around the 50th of 180 odd countries. But the issue here is, you know, how did they get to that estimate? And I don't think that they have any more information than I have on this. Around that estimate, there are a range of different estimates. So let's just think about what we're actually trying to measure here. Right, national income, as everybody knows, who's checked on Wikipedia or read a textbook, is the sum of all of the either the value of the output generated in the economy, the value of the expenditure, or the value of income. You have to measure those things. And you measure those using the prices in money terms of what they are. So how are people expected to go and measure Cuban GDP? Let's take the first measure, the most common way that we measure GDP all over the world. We look at expenditure. Okay, let's look at expenditure, consumer expenditure, the expenditure of firms, the expenditure of governments, and then you make an adjustment for exports and imports. If we look at domestic expenditure in Cuba, the prices of pretty much all basic goods, all basic consumption, that's food, that's housing, that's utilities, transport, they're set by the state. And the state sets them very low, not just a few percentage points lower than the market price, but actually a tiny fraction of the market price. So for example, if you want to buy rice that you're allocated on the ration as a minimum quantity, I think it's 20 cents of a Cuban peso per pound. If you went to try and buy that in the market, that would be 5 Cuban pesos. That's 1/25th of the market price. The same with the beans, it's 1/30th of the market price. So you've got one set of prices operating for basic goods, and then another set of prices for any goods outside of the basic basket. So how do you aggregate those numbers? In the textbook, it will tell you what you have to do is you have to adjust the prices for subsidies and indirect taxes. That's what you have to do. But in this case, the scale of the subsidy is so big. And if we think about what's in the subsidy, if you tried to measure what's the actual sort of cost price of producing a bus ride or beans or whatever, you'd have to include the labor cost. Now, workers are employed by the state, and their pay is sufficient. I mean, it's very low. State wages are very low, but it's meant to be sufficient to buy basic goods. So the wage level is also way below what it would be if the prices weren't heavily subsidized. So you've got a kind of a circular argument here. How do you disentangle this? And actually, nobody's attempted to do that. If I'd seen anybody do it, I'd say, okay, your figures are solid, but actually nobody's even attempted it. And it's something that I'm going to try to attempt in a study that I'm working on, is to actually look at the real value of Cuban wages, real value in terms of internationally comparable levels. Nobody's done it. So the problem with doing that is that yeah, there's all those subsidies. The other thing is, of course, Cubans are entitled to lots of free goods. Health and education is completely free. And the Cuban salaries are paid. They don't pay any tax. So if you like, there's an implicit tax in there, but it's not. It's deducted at source, so nobody knows what part of it is paying for health and education. We'll come to that a little bit more. But it does mean that nobody actually knows where the state subsidy is. If you go into the income, if you try to use the income method and look at people's incomes, you'd hit the same problem. And in particular, you've got a huge problem in incomes in actually trying to tell what's the difference between one person's income and another person's income, because people who earn in hard currency, there are two exchange rates, and they can use a 24-to-1, which is a hugely undervalued Cuban peso. And where are you? So the purchasing power parity is not clear at all. Now, and if you try to do it in output, I think actually output's the most accurate way you can do it. At least you know if you're trying to measure from year to year how much the economy has grown, you can tell if rice output has gone up by 10% in real solid rice terms. So some things at least you can assess the growth rate, but the value of them, the level of GDP. So if we look at the estimates actually, so this estimate comes in at about 9,000 per person per year. That's the UNDP estimate. There are estimates going both ways. One Cuban economist came out with a figure of just over 6,000 per year, and the Penn World Tables, and they do the purchasing power parity estimates. These are only estimates. They state very clearly this is not fact, this is just estimate. They've come out with a figure of 13,500 per person per year. So we've got a range of estimates that's going from 6 to like nearly 14. That's a very, very big range of estimates of Cuban GDP. And I think anybody who claims to have a firm figure is actually not telling the truth, which is what I've been doing for a lot of my career, is what is GDP? The figure that I've often usually used is the one close to the UNDP figure. So given that we can't actually do the conventional method, sometimes I go back to some, to look at what can you measure? What are the real measurables in this economy when you can't use value? And one of the things that one would look at, what can we use to benchmark? And I'm going to use two ways. The first is to look at the bottom line in terms of living standards. Okay, how do we, GDP, national income is supposed to be measuring living standards. And the bottom line, I think possibly, is life expectancy. Okay, so if we look at the World Health Organization life expectancy figures, we come up with a similar kind of ranking of the world's economies. And you've got Cuba coming in at around number 30 out of all of them, completely out of line with its estimated GDP. And it's actually almost exactly the same as the United States in terms of life expectancy, which is quite incredible. But obviously, we're not going to say that Cuban economy is as big as, the GDP per head is as big as the United States. Evidently not, but it is interesting. It's interesting also that the United States, I've got some figures for the total expenditure on health in the United States and other countries, and expenditure as a percentage of GDP. In the United States, they spend about 10,000 a head on health total. So if Cuba health spending were to be measured in terms of its outputs, in terms of life expectancy, you've got a £10,000 a head GDP to start with, because that's the value, not the monetary value, but that's the benefit value of health spending. But other countries, it's much, much less. But Cuba and the US actually have similar percentages of GDP spent on health, which is interesting. One GDP being a lot higher than the other. And then you have education as well. Education is also, in Cuba, there's universal education, free to all students right up to university and beyond, to PhD levels. And the percentage of GDP spent on education in Cuba is 13%, on health is 17%. And that percentage on education actually outstrips practically everywhere else. So health and education are a huge proportion of Cuban total output. That's on the Cuban estimates of GDP, which are kind of in the same range as mine. But actually, yeah. Anyway, so so that gives us one kind of answer, which doesn't really help us to assess GDP, but it gives us some kind of idea of living standards. Another way to measure a solid figure we have is to look at the external sector. That's the only part of the Cuban economy that's measured in dollars. Okay, so that gives us something to hang on to. If we can look at the external sector and see how it's behaved, we can see something of the picture of what's the performance of the Cuban economy and maybe kind of how large it is. And so this next chart is the most complicated one. And it actually provides a picture of the whole of Cuban economic history since 1990, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and shows the radical restructuring that's been going on over that time. First of all, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring on each of the major categories one by one in terms of the exports first, okay? So the first thing is to look at sugar. The Cuban economy has completely transformed. It is no longer a sugar-dependent economy. Used to be nearly 80% of export earnings used to be sugar. They're not anymore. It's tiny. It's about 3% or something like that. Very, very small. And in fact, they're net importers of sugar now in some years. Then we've got oil products, which seems an unlikely one. And in fact, it's only something that's emerged recently over here. And this was when, working with the Venezuelans, they built an oil refinery. So they were importing Venezuelan oil and exporting oil products. Okay, so that gives you a little surge here of some hint of the relationship with Venezuela. You can see the oil price diminished, and then actually deliveries also diminished, and it's nearly gone now. So the activity of the oil refinery is nearly finished. Other goods, and this is kind of interesting because what you see here with other goods is how small is the total, really, how the lack of diversification, and a large portion of that is actually nickel. So it's a commodity, primary commodity production, and the earnings fluctuate very, very widely when the nickel price changes. And so you had in 2008 to 9 a collapse in the nickel price, and that's where you see that fallback happening there. Then you have tourism. Now, tourism was one of the main drivers of the recovery in the 1990s and has been steadily growing ever since in terms of its earnings. After that, you have other services. Now, other services is quite a wide category. So it can be selling music, or it can be selling patented medicines, but mainly it's medical services. It's professional services, and professional services are mainly medical services. And most of those, as we know, have been sold to Venezuela. So you have an increase. Oh, look. And then, so you have an agreement signed at the end of 2004 for the sale of professional services to Venezuela. And in that deal, there was a link between the price that the Cubans got for those professional services and the price of oil, which was excellent timing from the Cubans' point of view, because it meant that they had a buffer against the hugely inflated oil prices during the oil price boom. But you can see also the fall, very radical fall in those earnings, but that coincided with the fall in the cost of importing fuel. And so it wasn't as devastating as it looks in the picture. And you can see the falling away as well of the oil products. And then the final line I'm going to put on here, this is the import spending. And the import spending is kind of the most interesting one. The relationship between total import spending and total export earnings gives you some kind of idea of how much foreign financing there was. And the remarkable thing about Cuba, the US sanctions haven't just meant that they have no GDP figures, but they've also meant that they've had almost no access to international finance. So in the early 1990s, well, if in 1990 you saw $2 billion worth of Soviet financing, and then that disappeared. So the next couple of years after that were just simply the exhaustion of international reserves. And then after that, then you have a small amount of remittances, which aren't included here, making up the difference between import spending and export earnings. So you just have a small amount. And then you have the beginning of the Venezuela arrangement, and Cuba feeling much more flush, increase in reserves as export earnings were bigger than import spending. And then you have the problem in 2008, you had import spending spiking, and that was partly they'd started an investment program, a very ambitious one, but also because they had 3 hurricanes in short succession, so they exhausted all of their reserves and had to import emergency food. And then a very, very sharp adjustment thereafter. But you can see as well that the high oil price inflating import spending and the Cienfuegos oil refinery, and then that's going down. So that gives you an idea of what's happened. But what's interesting for me in looking at that is you see that Cuban recovery has been fired by really just 3 things. It's nickel, tourism, and services. 3 enclave, distinct areas, typically of a developing country, typically of a socialist economy, is resources are put into those areas. You can galvanize, you can mobilize, you can get something done, but very little progress in diversification of exports, and very little progress in reducing dependence on food or fuel imports. And I think one of the problems created by their distorted domestic prices is the inability of Cuban enterprises to actually respond to international market signals. It's impossible using the dual exchange rate system that they have and the central planning system for allocating foreign exchange for Cuban businesses to actually calculate and to respond to their profitability, their competitiveness internationally. And therefore, they just have to have their foreign exchange allocated to them according to a central plan. So if you're producing tables in Cuba, you don't actually have a way to know whether you can do so competitively and start exporting them to the next island or marketing them internationally. And the same with import substitution. And so that this is one of the major problems. I think also it's very important to notice that the lack of access to international finance is actually unique. I've looked at the global figures for official development assistance, for foreign direct investment, for international financial flows, and Cuba is just cut off. So it has what economists would call the hardest macroeconomic budget constraint of any other country. So that's market discipline is stronger than anywhere else. So in this country, in the United States, if we have a downturn for whatever reason, we can borrow a bit of money, finance will come in, you can cushion, but they have no cushion. Cuba has no cushion, and it borrows at very expensive rates. Because it has no cushion, if you're lending to a country that has no cushion, then you're going to have to charge a high risk premium, because if anything happens, they're not going to be able to repay you. So you'll charge more money for it. So what finance they do have is incredibly expensive. So where does that take us? So that's kind of gives you some idea of the labyrinth in which Cuba is operating. Gives you some idea of the problems it creates as an economist to measure any comparative value of the economy. So my next question really is, would it help if Cuba were to be more conventional, right, in terms of becoming more measurable? So they have the central allocation, they have the state determined prices. Would it help? And my view is, and that I've come to, is that Cuba illustrates the problems as well as the benefits of a non-market system. Okay, these are huge issues, but I just want to, as an economist, just talk about some of those problems. And one of them is actually to do with social welfare and justice. As the Cuban economy opens out to the international market, as more tourists come in, as more people are servicing the tourists, more people are getting hard currency income. And the distortion of the exchange rate distorts everything. It's actually impossible to calculate a Gini coefficient for Cuba because there's no single unit of account because you've got the different currencies and different measures. So you can't calculate a Gini coefficient. Now, if you're a policymaker and you can't see what's happening to income inequality, you've got no way of measuring. The only thing they measure is, are basic needs met, which was very, very good during the economic emergency after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. They performed incredibly well in keeping people alive. But when you're moving towards a more diversified economy, a more open economy, you need to have some kind of a measure. So relative incomes are impossible to measure. And there's been talk about, Cuba's the only country in the region that doesn't have a minimum wage. Well, it doesn't have a minimum wage because that's not the issue. The issue is minimum access. They don't use wage as the measure of how wealthy you are or not. So I think for social policy, it's very important. I think also for morale and incentives, and I think that if anyone's been to Cuba, they will know the problem of morale and lack of incentives. If you're working for the state, your wage is so low that you feel that even though it's giving you entitlements to the basic needs and all the rest of it, which is a huge effort and all the rest of it, you feel that you're being insulted because your next door neighbor is earning a few cents in the foreign exchange sector. They're putting up a tourist in their room. And what they're getting is translatable into your salary using the exchange rate. You know, you only have to earn $31 a month in the external sector to be able to convert that into an average wage in Cuba. That doesn't mean that Cuban is living on the equivalent of $31 a month, because if they did, they would be dead. But it does mean that you have this kind of this distorted perceptions of values within the local economy. And it's contributing to a brain drain. People are moving out the state sector into the tourist sector, if you like, either the informal or formal. They're leaving the country. And people who are working in the shops or doing menial state sector jobs in particular, the professionals have their own motivation, as we know, as lecturers who don't get very much money. We know that you do it anyway for love. But people who are doing jobs that they don't particularly enjoy aren't doing it for love, and they pretty much show you that they're not. And then for efficiency and competitiveness, I've already touched on this, about the relationship between profitability and prices. The problem with having no proper unit of account in order to measure profitability means that the companies aren't able actually even to measure their efficiency or their competitiveness internationally. And then finally, access to finance. And this is a slightly different issue, is that if I do want to lend to Cuba, and if I can find a way around all of the US sanctions laws, which are very complicated and very difficult to get through and very discouraging, your legal department will definitely tell you not to touch it, the bank won't let you do the transfers. But if I were to get through all of those hoops and want to lend to Cuba, if you don't have a GDP figure, you can't actually see whether that economy is capable of repaying the debt. So if when I was at the IDB or when I was at the Economist Intelligence Unit, we were always measuring sovereign risk. Sovereign risk means the risk of not being repaid when you lend to the sovereign, to the government. And the risk of not being repaid is measured in terms of how big is their debt compared to their economy. And if you don't know how big the economy, you don't know how big the debt to economy ratio is, and therefore you have to add on a risk premium, or you just get put off it entirely. So it's taken a very long time for Cuba to renegotiate its debt, and actually in the economy slide, you could see that the export earnings were larger than import spending over the last few years, and that's actually because Raul Castro, ever since he got in, has been trying to service the debt to try to improve access to international finance. But this is a real problem for Cuba. And then the final question I put was that we should use Cuba. Cuba reminds me of the true meaning of GDP measurement and how difficult it is and how unreliable it is as a measure of what it's often used for. First of all, how are market values determined? Okay, so I keep saying that we should have values that are equivalent to the world market value of things. What determines world market prices of anything? And that's a philosophical question. It's a question that's been dealt with, by Marx, wrote for years about the relationship between price and value. The classical economists were very caught up in that question. But in recent development economics, there was a long discussion, obviously, about terms of trade and how the terms of trade tended to be unfavorable towards developing countries. So while Cuba was in the Soviet bloc, it had favorable terms of trade. Sugar was traded at a high price relative to the oil. And then it lost those. But if you think about the terms of trade generally, all the trade negotiations, which economies get the best deal? is the largest and most powerful economies get the best deal. The one example, of course, is intellectual property protection. So those countries which have the largest investment in intellectual property protect it like mad because they want to sustain a price which isn't a market price. It's a price that has their rents, their abnormal profits protected. So, I mean, I think so when you talk about what's the right exchange rate for Cuba, which would be the market exchange rate? What are market exchange rates? What do they reflect? So that raises some of those questions. The second question is, I think for me, the problem with Cuba not having a GDP figure has highlighted for me actually what GDP is very good at measuring. GDP is a measure for creditors. That is why it's done by the IMF and the World Bank. They lend money to countries, and they want to know whether they're going to get their money back. That's what it measures very well. So when people say GDP is not an adequate measure and all the rest of it, it's not because it's not an adequate measure, it's because it measures something very specific. It doesn't measure welfare. It never was meant to measure welfare. It's only meant to measure the credibility or the creditworthiness of a country. And finally, what are the limitations of GDP? I think we've seen here with some of the limitations, some very interesting work's been done within the UCL by Mazzucato on one of the things about what is valued in GDP figures and what isn't. And some things are not counted as productive historically or because they didn't used to exist, like financial services. The earnings of the financial sector be treated one way and then they get treated another way, and it makes a huge difference to the GDP figures. So GDP, we all need to study what GDP measures. Is it in dollar terms? Is it in PPP terms? Is what affects the dollar exchange rate? What affects the value of things? What's included? We know that the informal sector is not included. I mean, if the informal sector is very big, as it is in Cuba, that's a problem. So there are huge limitations to the GDP figure, and we should stop talking about it as if it's really the measure of anything more significant than creditworthiness. But having said that, creditworthiness is very important because if you can't get credit, then you have a hard budget constraint. And if you have a hard budget constraint, you suffer from what Cuba suffers from. So, but it's important for that reason and that reason only, really. Okay, so that's actually where I'm going to leave it, and just to leave it open to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Emily. So we have like 5 minutes for questions. So please go ahead.
Thanks, Emily. Can you say a bit about the two different currencies?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, most countries just have one currency. You have an exchange rate. The Cuban, under the Soviet system, they had an exchange rate that was fixed. 1 Soviet ruble was equivalent to 1 US dollar was equivalent to 1 Cuban peso. That was... So the Soviet ruble left, and the Cubans retained their one-to-one relationship. The Cuban peso was worth $1, and they continued to use that in their accounting. And so that's the figure that they use in their national account, in their fiscal accounts. It's the figure that they use in their enterprise accounts. But gradually, well, what happened in the early 90s is that the black market rate of the Cuban peso's value slumped. Okay, so in a time of shortages, imported goods became relatively more scarce and their price went right up. So the value of the Cuban peso went down relative to the dollar, and it collapsed to less than 1/100th of a dollar. That is more than 100 Cuban pesos per dollar at that time. And so it was in a tailspin. So expectations for the value of the Cuban peso were collapsing. And so they had what you call a structural adjustment, or an austerity package was introduced in 1994. Well, it wasn't an austerity package. It was. They took cigarettes and rum off the rations for a start. So they did various things. They started putting some user charges on some things that were free before, And so they had an adjustment, and they stabilized the value of the black market rate, which they then made legal, at around 24, 25. So then there was a black market rate, or a rate that was used for personal transactions, and a rate that was used for official transactions, two different rates. Now, as I said, with your Cuban pesos, you can buy much more than their dollar value is worth. So the Cuban peso is undervalued still. It was allowed to float in the 1990s, and then 2004 it got fixed at 24 to 1. So it's now badly undervalued. And so that distorts all of economic activity. The new private sector, which is now expanding, was actually allowed to work with what they call the unofficial, it's not illegal, it's called the Cadeca rate, the 24 to 1 rate. So the private sector is operating with an undervalued Cuban peso, and so can make profits even if it's very inefficient. While the public sector is operating with a 1-to-1, a hugely overvalued Cuban peso, which means it's impossible for them to make a profit on any exports. And so they have to get centrally allocated foreign exchange to compensate for the losses, the paper losses that they're making. So you've got these two different economies. So this is the biggest issue. It's been going, in 2013, they said, we're going to fix this, we're going to fix this. And they had a plan for day zero where they were going to unify the exchange rates. And it never happened. The reason it didn't happen is it's going to be very disruptive. And what the government does is it guarantees that nobody will get left behind. Well, when you have economic disruption, somebody's going to lose. And so they've been very, very, very cautious, and they're very gradually moving towards it. But they're stuck with this. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry. You said that one of the reasons why Cuba hasn't, I don't know how to say, speed up is because international financing.
Yeah.
Okay. I am from Honduras, Central America, and we have as a International Development Bank, a Central American Development Bank. In Cuba, I think through this year, 2019, is going to be a member. Yes, it is.
Well, sorry. The Inter-American Development Bank.
Central American Development
Central, oh yeah, the Central, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Same as the CACA.
Yeah.
So they will have access to international financing.
Yeah.
And a very good rate. So what do you think about it?
I think it's going to make a huge difference. Well, actually, I mean, the Central American Development Bank doesn't have all that much money, but it's a hugely significant moment. The EU is also moving in. And also the CAF, the Cooperación Andino de Fomento, they're all circling around. And that's actually why we've got a project on talking about infrastructure development. It's partly to prepare Cubans to have designed a good, sustainable, well-integrated policy before the money arrives, because the money can arrive and it can be wasted if you're not ready for it. So I do think it's hugely significant. I will actually believe it when I see it. This has been rumbling for many, many years. I do think it's time now, but obviously there's been a setback with the US threatening countries. Yeah.
About not being involved in US activities.
Absolutely.
So they could be a member.
Yeah.
Hello. Are there any official data provided by the Cuban government? And if so, how are they treated internationally?
Yeah. Yeah, there is Cuban data. The Cuban data is actually very good, and they actually have 3,000 government statisticians, but they're trained in quantitative measures. So they know how many, bus parts they've produced, or how much rice, or what, so they know those things. They don't know that much. The agricultural data is very bad because so much agricultural data is not registered, because people eat it before, or they sell it to somebody before they circulate it. So that some of it's better than others, but it's professionally collected, and it's not, people say, Cuba's a communist country, we know about these communist countries, they always lie about their production. That's not the problem in Cuba. The problem is just simply aggregating prices which don't have enough meaning. And also in some areas, they also conceal data. But they have a website, the Oficina Nacional de Estadística y Información, and they have a website with their data, and it's all put up there. There are gaps. It's not as extensive as I'd like it to be, and there are delays, but it's useful.
When you were talking about exports, you were saying one of the problems is not being able to assess whether their products actually are competitive with externally producing. But you also talked a little bit about IP-based products and how they're not essentially value-based in quite the same way, they're monopoly-based. Is it possible for Cuba to actually try, I mean, I know there have been attempts to try and fight their way out by using IP-based approaches in medicine and education and so on. Is that big enough potentially to actually help them escape from this situation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Actually, you know, in the early 1990s, they didn't have any time or interest in protecting patents, and but now they definitely have, and they particularly have a biotechnology industry which is well respected. They've found huge difficulties getting into international markets, partly because of the domination of US multinationals in there, but they're working at it. They've even got some trials happening in the US on one of the medicines for diabetic ulcers, which is very effective, and they're selling to other places. So there is huge potential. And actually in that chart that I showed, there is a line for biotechnology products, and it's quite small, but it's actually growing significantly. And I think that if you were to project that out in the future, that would be one of the bigger elements. So it's important. I think they need more international collaboration. They need more partners to run the trials and to get registration and all the rest of it. They tend to sell to China, India, Brazil, and not into the US or European markets. But they're making headway, and they've got some very interesting products. You know, a handful of really very important ones, and one of them is this diabetic thing. It actually cures the ulcers that cause people to have their legs amputated. So in the US, obviously, that's a big issue. Yeah.
Time for one more question. An additional question? That side, no? Oh, yeah.
Just a simple question. What's your quick fix then for the Cuban economy? What would you do?
That's a lovely one to know. I mean, I always said that I always had to forecast the Cuban economy and try to understand it and analyze it, but never prescribe. And I've always steered away from that question. But the Cubans now ask me, you know, so what should we do? And I'm like, you know more than I do. You know, I don't know how you manage to keep everybody alive during the special period. You know, but I do think, I mean, what I am arguing when I talk to them is that the exchange rate, the unification, isn't something that they can delay any longer. It's creating a new private sector which is completely inefficient. You know, the people are doing things like being a car park attendant or handing out lavatory paper in toilets, you know, which are so unproductive. I mean, it's just a waste of human capital to do that. But if you convert it from dollars into Cuban pesos, it's worth doing. So so every day that passes, it's creating this distorted new economy, and every day that passes, the state economy is unable to move, really. They have to wait a year. They have to plan a year in advance to get their foreign exchange based on the way that they do their accounts, and that's no way to respond to opportunities in the global market. It's just not possible. So I'd say that was the most urgent thing. And it is difficult for them, because any other country that's tried to do that, or, you know, rapid change, would be backed up by some kind of guarantees or support from the IMF or the World Bank to help them through the period of transition. And they don't have any cushion. And so that's why they're so reluctant. One, they don't have any cushion. Two, they have an ideological, political commitment not to leave anybody behind. And that makes it much, much harder. So I would say that they have to do that, but I wouldn't tell them how they should do it.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's support.